The morning tide brought Inspector Clarence Thorne to Beacon Point with his leather satchel and government seal, his polished boots clicking against the wet stone steps carved into the cliff face. Martha Whitmore pressed her face to the kitchen window of the lighthouse cottage, watching him climb toward their isolated world with the methodical pace of a man who carried authority in every measured step. The salt spray had already darkened his wool coat, and she could see him pause twice to adjust his grip on the iron railing, his breathing visible in small white puffs against the October chill. "Martha!" Her husband's voice cut through the sound of wind and waves from behind her. "Step away from the window." She turned to find Ezra standing in the doorway, his massive frame filling the space between kitchen and parlor. 23 years of marriage had taught her to read the warning signs in his weathered face. The tightness around his gray eyes, the way his calloused hands hung motionless at his sides instead of reaching for his pipe or the morning paper. The inspector's visit had been announced by telegram 3 days prior, but Ezra had shared none of the details with her beyond the bare fact of his coming. "The inspector will want to speak with both of us," Martha said, smoothing her apron over her dark wool dress. She had chosen her most conservative outfit that morning, the one with sleeves that covered her wrists completely and a collar that rose nearly to her chin. "No." Ezra's voice carried the same inflexible tone he used when speaking to the Coast Guard radio or reading weather reports aloud to himself. "You will remain upstairs while he conducts his business. You will not speak to him, you will not listen at doors, and you will not ask questions about his purpose here." Martha felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever Ezra established one of his rules. In their early years of marriage, when they had lived in the fishing village of Millbrook with neighbors and shops, and the constant sound of other voices, his protective instincts had seemed merely old-fashioned. But here on Beacon Point, where the nearest neighbor lived 8 miles inland, and the lighthouse keeper's cottage sat like a small fortress against the endless Atlantic, his rules had multiplied and hardened into something that felt less like protection and more like imprisonment. "I am the keeper's wife," she said carefully, choosing her words as she might choose stones to cross a stream. "Surely Inspector Thorne will expect to meet me. It would seem strange if I remained hidden." Ezra crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and gripped her shoulder with one large hand. His touch was firm, but not cruel. He had never struck her, never raised his voice beyond what was necessary to be heard over the wind. But his fingers found the exact spot where her collarbone curved toward her neck, and she could feel the strength in them, the reminder of what he could do if she pushed too far. "Listen carefully," he said, his face close enough that she could smell the coffee on his breath and see the network of fine lines that salt air had carved around his eyes. "Inspector Thorne is here because someone has been asking questions in town. Questions about the lighthouse, about our work here, about things that are none of their concern. When people ask questions about lighthouse keepers, Martha, it usually means someone thinks we have failed in our duties." He released her shoulder and moved to the window, peering down at the figure of Inspector Thorne, who had reached the halfway point of his climb and stopped to examine something on the cliff face. Martha rubbed the spot where Ezra's fingers had rested and tried to imagine what questions a stranger might ask in the village. In the 5 years since they had taken the keeper's position, she had ventured into Millbrook only a handful of times, always with Ezra, always for essential supplies they could not order by mail or obtain from the monthly Coast Guard delivery. "What kind of questions?" she asked. "The kind that could cost us this position." Ezra's shoulders were rigid beneath his flannel shirt. "The kind that could send us back to Millbrook with no income and no prospects. Do you remember what that was like, Martha? Do you remember the look in Mrs. Henderson's eyes when we fell behind on the rent? Do you remember how the other wives whispered when you passed them on the street?" She remembered. The cramped rooms above the fish market, the smell that never left their clothes, the way conversations stopped when she entered the general store. She remembered the morning Ezra had come home with the lighthouse appointment letter, how his hands had shaken as he read it aloud, how they had both wept with relief and gratitude. "But what questions?" she pressed. "What could anyone possibly want to know about us?" Ezra turned from the window with an expression she had not seen before. Not anger, exactly, but something deeper and more dangerous. Fear, perhaps, though she had never known him to be afraid of anything. "3 weeks ago," he said slowly, "a woman came to Millbrook asking about the Isabella Marie." The name hit Martha like a physical blow. The Isabella Marie, the merchant vessel that had vanished in the storm of 1899, the ship that haunted the local newspapers and Coast Guard reports, the ghost that every lighthouse keeper along this stretch of coast carried in their records and their nightmares. She had read about it in the old logbooks when they first arrived at Beacon Point, had seen the careful entries in her predecessor's handwriting. Heavy fog, visibility poor, heard distress signals at approximately 11:30 in the evening, but could not determine direction or distance. "What woman?" Martha whispered. "A reporter from Boston. She spoke to the harbor master, to old Captain Brewster, to anyone who might remember the storm. And when she ran out of locals to interview, she started asking about the lighthouse. About who was keeper then. About whether the light was functioning properly. About whether anyone had ever suggested that the Isabella Marie might have been lost due to keeper negligence." The sound of boots on the wooden steps outside announced Inspector Thorne's arrival at their door. Ezra straightened his shoulders and adjusted his suspenders, transforming himself from worried husband back into the steady, reliable keeper of Beacon Point Light. "You will go upstairs now," he said to Martha. "You will remain in our bedroom with the door closed until the inspector leaves. You will not make any sound that might draw his attention to your presence. And Martha," he paused with his hand on the front door latch, "if you are ever approached by anyone asking questions about the Isabella Marie, you will tell them nothing. You will not speculate. You will not share theories. You will not even acknowledge that you know the name. Do you understand?" She nodded, though her throat felt too tight to speak. The heavy knock that came at that moment seemed to echo through her bones, and she could hear something else beneath it, the sound that had been haunting her dreams for weeks now. In the storm winds that howled around the lighthouse on rough nights, in the peculiar way the air moved through the lamp room's ventilation system, she had been hearing what sounded almost like voices, like singing, like the kind of song sailors might sing in the final moments before their ship disappeared beneath the waves. "Mrs. Whitmore," Ezra's voice was sharp now. "Upstairs, now!" She climbed the narrow wooden stairs with her hand trailing along the smooth banister, listening to Ezra's footsteps cross the kitchen floor below. The front door opened with its familiar squeal of hinges that needed oil, and she heard Inspector Thorne's voice for the first time. Cultured, authoritative, tinged with the flat vowels of someone educated in Boston or New York. "Mr. Whitmore, I trust you received my telegram regarding this inspection." "Yes, sir. Though I confess I am not certain what has prompted it. Our quarterly reports have been submitted on time. Our equipment is in proper working order, and we have received no complaints from mariners regarding the function of our light." Martha reached the top of the stairs and moved toward the bedroom she shared with Ezra. But instead of entering immediately, she paused in the hallway. The voices from below carried clearly through the old house's thin walls and floors, and she found herself unable to resist the pull of the conversation taking place in her own kitchen. "Indeed, your reports have been exemplary," Inspector Thorne was saying. "However, certain questions have been raised regarding historical incidents in this area. I am here to conduct a routine review of lighthouse records dating back to 1899. There was a long pause, filled only by the sound of chairs scraping against the kitchen floor and the distant crash of waves against the rocks below. Martha held her breath, pressing her ear closer to the stair railing. "I see." Ezra's voice had taken on the careful neutrality he used when speaking to Coast Guard officials or supply boat captains. May I ask what specific incident has prompted this review? The loss of the merchant vessel Isabella Marie on October 15th, 1899. I am sure you are familiar with the case from your predecessor's records. Another pause. Longer this time. Martha could imagine Ezra calculating his response, weighing each word for its potential consequences. She had seen him perform this same mental process dozens of times over their years of marriage. The moment when her spontaneous, passionate husband transformed himself into the careful, guarded man his position required him to be. Yes, sir. The loss of the Isabella Marie was recorded in the station logbook by Keeper Samuel Morrison. A tragic incident, but as I understand it, no fault was found with the lighthouse operation that night. That is correct. However, new information has come to light that suggests the incident may warrant further investigation. Martha felt her legs grow weak beneath her. She gripped the banister with both hands and slowly lowered herself to sit on the top step, her dark skirts spreading around her like spilled ink. New information. What new information could possibly exist after 24 years? And what did it have to do with her and Ezra, who had not even been at Beacon Point when the Isabella Marie was lost? I am afraid I do not understand, Ezra was saying. What new information could be relevant after so many years? A trunk was discovered last month in the basement of the Millbrook Harbor Authority building. It contained personal effects and documents belonging to passengers and crew of the Isabella Marie, items that were apparently recovered from debris that washed ashore in the weeks following the wreck. Among these items was a ship's log that had been maintained by First Mate Thomas Hartwell. Martha pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. A ship's log. An official record of the Isabella Marie's final voyage, written by someone who had been aboard when she foundered. Such a document would contain details about weather conditions, navigation decisions, the precise time and location where the ship had encountered trouble. It might even contain information about whether the crew had seen Beacon Point light in their final hours, whether they had tried to signal for help, whether the lighthouse had failed them in some crucial way. The log indicates that the Isabella Marie's crew observed what they believed to be signals from shore during the storm, Inspector Thorne continued. Specifically, they noted seeing a pattern of lights that did not match the standard lighthouse beacon. The first mate wrote that these signals appeared to be directing them toward what they assumed was a safe harbor, but which actually led them into the rocks near Widow's Cove. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the eternal sound of wind through the lighthouse's iron framework. Martha found herself counting her own heartbeats, waiting for Ezra's response, trying to understand the implications of what she had just heard. Widow's Cove lay 3 miles south of Beacon Point, a narrow inlet surrounded by jagged granite formations that local fishermen avoided even in calm weather. If the Isabella Marie had been wrecked there, instead of in the open ocean, as everyone had always assumed, it would mean the ship had been much closer to shore when she foundered. It would mean her crew might have survived the initial disaster, might have reached land, might have lived long enough to leave records of what had happened to them. Inspector Thorne, Ezra's voice was steady but strained. I hope you are not suggesting that Keeper Morrison was somehow responsible for misleading the Isabella Marie. The man served this station with distinction for 15 years. His reputation was beyond reproach. I am not suggesting anything at this time, Mr. Whitmore. I am merely conducting a thorough investigation based on newly discovered evidence. As part of this investigation, I will need to examine all lighthouse records from October of 1899, including the station logbook, maintenance reports, and any correspondence with Coast Guard authorities. Martha heard footsteps crossing the kitchen floor, the sound of cabinet doors opening and closing, papers rustling. Ezra was retrieving the official records from the locked cabinet where he kept all documents related to lighthouse operations. She had seen him work at that cabinet countless times, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he handled the old ledgers and reports, his lips moving silently as he read entries written by keepers who had served Beacon Point before him. "These are the records you will need," Ezra said. "As you can see, Keeper Morrison's entries for October 15th indicate that he maintained the standard beacon throughout the night, despite difficult weather conditions. There is no mention of any irregular signals or deviation from normal procedures. Thank you. I will review these carefully." There was a pause, filled by the sound of papers being shuffled and organized. "Mr. Whitmore, I must ask, have you or your wife ever heard local stories or rumors about the Isabella Marie? Any suggestion that the official account of her loss might be incomplete?" Martha's breath caught in her throat. She could feel Ezra's hesitation from 2 rooms away, could sense him choosing his words with the same care a sailor might use to navigate shallow water in fog. "No, sir. My wife and I have lived quite isolated lives here at Beacon Point. We rarely engage in village gossip or local speculation about historical events." "I see. And has anyone ever approached you with questions about the Isabella Marie or about lighthouse operations during that period?" "No, sir." The lie fell from Ezra's lips with such smoothness that Martha almost believed it herself. But she remembered his earlier words about the reporter from Boston, about the questions that had prompted this inspection, about the fear she had seen in his eyes when he spoke of losing their position. "Very well. I will spend the remainder of the day reviewing these documents. I trust you will be available if I have additional questions." "Of course, sir." "I will be conducting routine maintenance on the lamp assembly, but I can be reached at any time." Martha heard chairs scraping against the floor again, footsteps moving toward the front door. Inspector Thorne was leaving, at least temporarily, but she sensed that his departure was more like a strategic withdrawal than a conclusion. He would return with more questions, more documents, more threads to pull, until the carefully woven fabric of their life at Beacon Point began to unravel. She remained sitting on the top step long after the front door closed, long after Ezra's footsteps faded as he climbed the spiral staircase to the lighthouse lamp room. The house felt different now, charged with secrets and possibilities that had not existed an hour before. The Isabella Marie was no longer just a name in an old logbook. She had become a living presence, a ghost with enough substance to threaten their future. As afternoon faded toward evening, Martha finally rose from her position on the stairs and moved to the bedroom window that faced south toward Widow's Cove. The tide was going out, exposing the dark rocks that formed a treacherous maze along the shoreline. She had walked that stretch of coast once, early in their tenure at Beacon Point, and had been struck by how the granite formations seemed to reach out from the water like grasping fingers. If the Isabella Marie had indeed foundered there, if her crew had managed to reach shore, what had become of them? Had they died of exposure on the rocks? Had they struggled inland through the dense forest that covered the hills between Widow's Cove and the nearest road? Or had something else happened to them? Something that would explain why their fate had remained hidden for 24 years? The wind was picking up as it always did near sunset, and Martha found herself listening for the sounds that had been haunting her dreams. There, in the way the air moved through the lighthouse's ventilation system, in the particular note the wind struck when it passed through the iron framework, she could hear it again. The sound that might have been singing, might have been voices calling across water, might have been nothing more than her imagination transforming the eternal music of wind and wave into something more human and more desperate. But as she stood in the window, watching the last light fade from the western sky, Martha made a decision that would have horrified her husband. Tomorrow, while Ezra was occupied with Inspector Thorne's continued investigation, she would find a way to learn more about the Isabella Marie. She would discover what had really happened in Widow's Cove 24 years ago, and she would find out why the truth was important enough to threaten their carefully constructed life on Beacon Point. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening water with its familiar rhythm. 4 seconds of brilliance followed by 6 seconds of darkness, the pattern that had guided mariners safely past these rocks for 30 years. But tonight, as Martha watched the light carve its path through the gathering dusk, she found herself wondering if there were other signals hidden in that beam, other messages being sent across the water to ships that existed now only in memory and in the dreams of those who had loved them. The Millbrook Public Library stood like a weathered sentinel at the corner of Harbor Street and Pine, its red brick facade darkened by decades of salt air and winter storms. Martha approached it through the morning fog with her heart hammering against her ribs, clutching a canvas shopping bag that she hoped would disguise her true purpose for venturing into town. She had told Ezra she needed supplies from Henderson's general store, thread for mending, lamp oil, writing paper, common necessities that required no explanation or discussion. The lie had come easily, perhaps too easily. As she walked the 8 miles of winding dirt road that connected Beacon Point to civilization, Martha had found herself cataloging all the small deceptions she had practiced over the years of their marriage. The books she read when Ezra was tending the light, borrowed secretly from the Coast Guard supply boat captain. The letters she had written to her sister in Portland but never sent, hidden in the bottom drawer of her dresser. The nights she had climbed to the lighthouse gallery after Ezra fell asleep, just to feel the wind on her face and watch the stars wheel overhead in patterns her husband would never think to notice. Now, as she climbed the library's granite steps with their worn depression in the center where thousands of feet had passed, she was adding a more serious transgression to her private catalog of rebellions. Inspector Thorne had returned to Beacon Point at dawn with a government clerk and several boxes of additional documents. She had watched from the bedroom window as they established themselves at the kitchen table, like generals planning a campaign, spreading papers and ledgers across the scarred oak surface where she and Ezra normally shared their silent meals. The library's heavy oak door opened with a whisper of well-oiled hinges, and Martha stepped into a world that smelled of leather bindings and lemon oil, of old paper, and the peculiar mustiness that seemed to cling to buildings where knowledge was stored and secrets were kept. Miss Catherine Brewster, the librarian, looked up from her desk near the front windows with the sharp attention of a woman who noticed everything that happened in her domain. "Mrs. Whitmore." Miss Brewster's voice carried genuine surprise. "How unexpected to see you in town." "I hope all is well at Beacon Point." Martha had known Catherine Brewster since childhood. They had attended the same one-room schoolhouse, had learned their letters from the same stern teacher, had grown up in the shadow of the same granite hills and restless sea. But 23 years of marriage to Ezra had transformed Martha from Catherine's friend into something more like a curiosity, a woman who appeared in Millbrook so rarely that her presence was noteworthy. "Quite well, thank you." Martha adjusted her grip on the shopping bag and tried to project the casual air of someone running ordinary errands. "I was hoping to consult some historical records, if I may. I have been reading about local maritime history, and I find myself curious about some of the older incidents." Something flickered in Catherine's dark eyes. Interest, perhaps, or recognition. She was a tall woman, taller than Martha, with graying brown hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of precise movements that came from years of handling fragile documents. Her position as town librarian gave her access to records and archives that most residents never saw, and Martha suspected that Catherine knew more about Millbrook's secrets than anyone else who still drew breath. "What particular incidents interest you?" Catherine asked, rising from her desk and smoothing her dark wool skirt. Martha took a breath that tasted of dust and possibility. "The Isabella Marie, the merchant vessel that was lost in 1899. Catherine's expression did not change, but Martha caught the slight pause before she responded. the careful weighing of words that suggested this was not the first time someone had asked about the Isabella Marie recently. I see. May I ask what has prompted your interest in that particular tragedy? The question hung between them like a challenge. Martha could feel Catherine evaluating her, trying to determine whether she was merely a bored housewife seeking distraction or something more dangerous. A person who might upset carefully maintained balances, who might ask uncomfortable questions about comfortable lies. I have been hearing stories, Martha said carefully. Fragments of conversation, references in old newspapers. I confess I am curious about what actually happened that night. Catherine nodded slowly, as if Martha had passed some kind of test. She moved toward the back of the library, past shelves lined with volumes of local history and genealogy, past tables where elderly men read newspapers and made careful notes in margins. At the rear of the building, she unlocked a door marked Archives, Authorized Personnel Only, and gestured for Martha to follow her into a narrow room lined floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and document boxes. The Isabella Marie has been much discussed lately, Catherine said, pulling a keyring from her apron pocket. Inspector Thorne spent considerable time here yesterday, reviewing our maritime records. He seemed particularly interested in newspaper accounts from the weeks following the wreck. Martha's pulse quickened. What did the newspapers report? The usual things, initially. Storm conditions, presumed loss of all hands, sympathy for the families of the missing crew members. Catherine unlocked one of the tall filing cabinets and withdrew a manila folder thick with yellowed newspaper clippings. But there were other reports as well. Accounts that were published once or twice, and then never mentioned again. She placed the folder on a small reading table and opened it to reveal newspaper pages from the Millbrook Weekly Herald, the Portland Evening Express, and the Boston Globe. The headlines were stark and matter-of-fact. Merchant vessel lost in storm. Search continues for missing ship. Maritime tragedy claims 15 lives. But as Martha scanned the articles, she began to notice discrepancies in the details. Some reports placed the Isabella Marie's last known position 15 miles offshore. Others suggested she had been seen much closer to land. Several articles mentioned debris washing ashore near Widow's Cove, but one brief item in the Boston Globe referred to personal effects recovered from beaches as far south as Pemaquid Point. These accounts don't agree with each other, Martha murmured. No, they don't. Catherine pulled out a second folder, this one containing handwritten documents. Which becomes even more interesting when you consider these. The papers Catherine spread on the table were Coast Guard incident reports, harbor authority statements, and what appeared to be testimony from local fishermen who had been questioned about the storm. Martha leaned closer, trying to decipher the careful copperplate handwriting of official scribes. Samuel Morrison, keeper of Beacon Point Light, states that visibility was severely limited throughout the evening of October 15th, she read aloud. Light maintained at full intensity despite high winds and precipitation. No vessels observed in vicinity of lighthouse during hours of darkness. She looked up at Catherine. But Inspector Thorne mentioned a ship's log that suggested the crew of the Isabella Marie saw signals from shore that night. Yes. Catherine's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. That ship's log has created quite a stir. It contradicts nearly every official account of the incident. Martha continued reading, working her way through testimony from fishermen who had reported seeing strange lights along the coast that night, from Coast Guard personnel who had participated in the search for survivors, from townspeople who had combed the beaches for debris in the days following the storm. A pattern began to emerge. Not of a single merchant vessel lost in open water, but of something more complex and more troubling. According to this, Martha said, pointing to a fisherman's statement, debris from the Isabella Marie continued washing ashore for nearly 2 months after the storm, but some of the items that were recovered. She paused, reading more carefully. Personal luggage, ship's equipment, pieces of the hull, they showed evidence of fire damage. Fire damage that could not be explained by the storm itself, Catherine confirmed. And there were other anomalies, items that suggested the ship's cargo had been partially removed before she foundered. Testimony from residents of Widow's Cove who claimed to have heard voices calling for help on the night of the storm, voices that seemed to come from shore rather than from the water. Martha felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the archive room's single window. What kind of voices? Men calling out in what sounded like distress, women singing, or perhaps keening, the way Irish women mourn their dead, and children. Catherine's face had gone pale beneath her precisely arranged hair. Several witnesses reported hearing children crying, though the Isabella Marie's passenger manifest listed no children among those aboard. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of footsteps in the library's main room and the distant chiming of the town clock. Martha stared at the documents spread before her, trying to make sense of information that seemed to shift and contradict itself with each new detail. "Miss Brewster," she said slowly, "what do you believe really happened to the Isabella Marie?" Catherine closed the folders with movements that seemed almost ritualistic, as if she were performing some kind of protective ceremony. "I believe," she said carefully, "that the official account of that night leaves out more than it includes. I believe there were survivors who reached shore, and I believe something happened to them after they reached land, something that certain people in this town have spent 24 years trying to keep hidden." "What people?" "People with the power to suppress newspaper reports, to influence official investigations, to ensure that inconvenient questions are never asked in public forums." Catherine locked the filing cabinet and returned the keyring to her pocket. People who might have good reasons for wanting the Isabella Marie to remain a simple story of maritime tragedy rather than something more complicated. Martha gathered her shopping bag and prepared to leave, but Catherine's next words stopped her at the archive room door. "Mrs. Whitmore, I should mention that you are not the first person to ask about the Isabella Marie recently. 3 weeks ago, a young woman from Boston spent several days reviewing these same documents. She said she was researching maritime disasters for a book she was writing, but I suspect her interests were more specific than that." "What was her name?" "Miss Eleanor Hartwell. She claimed to be working on a general survey of shipping accidents along the Maine coast, but she focused almost exclusively on the Isabella Marie. And when she left Millbrook, she took with her copies of several documents that I probably should not have allowed her to duplicate." The name Hartwell struck Martha like a physical blow. Thomas Hartwell, the first mate whose ship's log had contradicted all the official reports about the Isabella Marie's final night. Eleanor Hartwell could be his daughter, his niece, perhaps even his widow, if he had been young enough in 1899 to have survived and married later. Did she say where she was staying? Whether she planned to return? Catherine shook her head. She left no forwarding information. But Mrs. Whitmore, I feel I should warn you. The day after Miss Hartwell departed, I received a visit from Mayor Aldrich and Harbor Master Crowley. They suggested that the library's maritime archives might benefit from being reorganized, and that some of the older, less reliable documents might be better stored elsewhere for the protection of researchers. Martha understood the implication immediately. Mayor Aldrich and Harbor Master Crowley were not the kind of men who took sudden interest in library administration unless they had compelling reasons to do so. Their visit to Catherine had been a warning disguised as a suggestion, an attempt to limit access to information that might prove embarrassing or dangerous to people in positions of authority. "Have you moved any of the documents?" "Not yet." Catherine's smile was thin and sharp. "I told them that any reorganization of historical materials would require proper consultation with the State Historical Society, and that such a process might take several months to complete. But Mrs. Whitmore, I suspect that my delaying tactics will not be effective indefinitely." They returned to the library's main room, where several patrons continued to read newspapers and conduct their quiet research. Martha paused at Catherine's desk, pretending to examine a display of new book acquisitions, while actually scanning the room for anyone who might be paying unusual attention to their conversation. "Miss Brewster," she said quietly, "if someone wanted to learn more about what happened at Widow's Cove that night, if someone wanted to find physical evidence rather than just documentary accounts, where would they begin to look?" Catherine picked up a leather-bound volume and opened it as if she were discussing its contents with a casual patron. "The official search for Isabella Marie survivors was called off after 1 week," she murmured. "But local residents continued to find debris and personal effects for months afterward. Much of what was recovered was never catalogued or turned over to authorities. Where did it go? Private collections, mostly. People who lived along that stretch of coast kept items they found, either as curiosities or because they hoped to return them to surviving family members someday. Old Captain Brewster, my uncle, had quite a collection of such artifacts stored in his barn. When he died 5 years ago, his son moved everything to the basement of the Harbor Authority building." Martha felt her heart skip. The Harbor Authority basement, the same location where Inspector Thorne had discovered the trunk containing Thomas Hartwell's ship's log. If other Isabella Marie artifacts were stored there as well, they might contain additional information that could shed light on what had really happened that night. Is the Harbor Authority building accessible to the public? Not officially, but Harbor Master Crowley is predictable in his habits. Every Wednesday afternoon at precisely 2 o'clock, he walks to the Anchor Inn for his weekly meeting with the town selectmen. He locks his office, but the basement storage area. Catherine smiled. Let us say that the lock on that door has been unreliable for several years. Martha nodded her understanding and moved toward the library's front door. But Catherine's voice followed her with one final piece of advice. "Mrs. Whitmore, if you do decide to pursue this matter further, I would suggest extreme caution. The people who have spent 24 years keeping the Isabella Marie's secrets are not likely to welcome additional scrutiny, and your husband's position at Beacon Point could easily become a casualty of any investigation that threatens established interests in this community." The walk back to Beacon Point passed in a blur of churning thoughts and mounting anxiety. Martha's canvas shopping bag now contained the supplies she had claimed to need: thread, lamp oil, writing paper, but her mind was entirely occupied with the information Catherine had shared. By the time she reached the lighthouse cottage, the afternoon sun was slanting low through the windows, and she could hear voices from the kitchen where Inspector Thorne continued his meticulous review of records. She climbed the stairs to their bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, staring out the window toward Widow's Cove while she processed everything she had learned. The Isabella Marie had not been simply lost at sea. She had foundered close to shore, close enough for survivors to reach land. Those survivors had apparently lived long enough to call for help, to leave evidence of their presence, to create the kind of witnesses that made official silence necessary. But what had happened to them after they reached shore? Had they died of exposure? Their bodies buried in unmarked graves to avoid complications for the authorities? Had they been helped to leave the area quietly, sworn to secrecy about the circumstances of their rescue? Or had something darker occurred, something that would explain why the mere mention of Thomas Hartwell's ship's log was enough to bring a government inspector to Beacon Point with boxes of documents and an agenda that threatened her husband's career? As evening approached and the lighthouse beam began its nightly sweep across the darkening water, Martha made her second decision in as many days. Tomorrow was Wednesday. At precisely 2 o'clock, while Harbor Master Crowley attended his weekly meeting and Inspector Thorne continued his investigation at Beacon Point, she would find her way into the basement of the Harbor Authority building. She would discover what other secrets had been stored there alongside Thomas Hartwell's ship's log, and she would finally learn the truth about what had happened to the Isabella Marie and her passengers on that October night 24 years ago. The sound that had been haunting her dreams rose again with the evening wind, voices carried on the salt air, singing that might have been mourning, calls for help that seemed to echo across decades of silence. But tonight, as Martha listened to those phantom sounds, she no longer wondered if they were real. She was beginning to suspect that they were the voices of people who had died with stories untold, secrets unshared, truths that demanded to be spoken regardless of the consequences for those who heard them. Wednesday afternoon brought a cold drizzle that turned the dirt roads around Millbrook into ribbons of treacherous mud, and Martha was grateful for the weather's concealing embrace as she made her way through the village's narrow streets toward the Harbor Authority building. She had waited until she saw Inspector Thorne's government clerk depart Beacon Point with an armload of documents, waited until Ezra became absorbed in explaining the lighthouse's mechanical systems to his unwelcome visitor, waited until the routine of their investigation created enough distraction for her to slip away unnoticed. The Harbor Authority building squatted on the wharf like a weathered toad, its gray clapboard siding stained with salt spray and decades of neglect. Through the rain-streaked windows of the main office, Martha could see that Harbor Master Crowley had indeed departed for his weekly meeting, leaving behind only the usual clutter of shipping manifests, tide charts, and coffee-stained ledgers that comprised the administrative detritus of a small fishing port. She circled the building once, noting the basement entrance on the north side, a heavy wooden door set into a foundation of granite blocks that glistened with moisture from the persistent drizzle. The lock that Catherine had described as unreliable proved to be not merely loose, but actually broken, hanging from the doorframe by a single bent screw that looked as though it had been damaged months or even years earlier. The basement smelled of low tide and old wood, of rope that had absorbed decades of salt air and metal that had surrendered to the patient advance of rust. What little light filtered through the grimy windows revealed a space packed with the accumulated debris of maritime commerce. Coils of chain, broken lobster traps, canvas sails that would never again fill with wind, and wooden crates stacked in precarious towers that reached toward the low ceiling. Martha moved carefully through the maze of stored equipment, her eyes adjusting to the dim light as she searched for anything that might be connected to the Isabella Marie. Most of the crates bore stenciled labels indicating their contents: fishing gear, Crowley, charts and instruments, various, personal effects, estate of J. Morrison. This last caught her attention, and she wondered if J. Morrison might be related to Samuel Morrison, the lighthouse keeper who had been on duty the night the Isabella Marie was lost. She was examining the Morrison crate when she heard footsteps on the floor above, the distinctive rhythm of someone moving with purpose through the Harbor Authority office. Martha froze, listening to the sounds of drawers opening and closing, papers rustling, a chair scraping across wooden planks. Harbor Master Crowley had returned early from his meeting, or perhaps someone else had business in the building that could not wait for official hours. The footsteps moved toward the basement door, and Martha realized with growing panic that she had no escape route. The basement's only entrance was the door through which she had entered, and whoever was upstairs would certainly see her if she tried to leave now. She looked around desperately for a hiding place and spotted a gap between two tall stacks of crates near the back wall of the basement. She squeezed herself into the narrow space just as the basement door opened with a groan of hinges and yellow lamplight spilled down the wooden stairs. The footsteps that descended were heavy but careful, belonging to someone who knew the basement's layout well enough to navigate it safely in uncertain light. "I know you are down here." The voice belonged to Harbor Master Crowley, but it carried a tone Martha had never heard from the usually jovial man who supervised Millbrook's small fleet of fishing boats and trading vessels. "Miss Eleanor Hartwell, isn't it? Come out where I can see you properly." Martha's blood turned to ice water in her veins. Eleanor Hartwell, Thomas Hartwell's relative, the woman from Boston who had been researching the Isabella Marie, was somewhere in this basement, presumably hiding just as Martha was hiding, both of them trespassing in a space where dangerous secrets were stored. "I said come out." Crowley's voice grew harder. "I saw you enter the building, and I know you did not leave. We can conduct this conversation like civilized people, or I can summon the constable and have you arrested for breaking and entering." A figure emerged from behind a stack of canvas-wrapped bundles near the east wall of the basement. A young woman in a dark traveling dress, her brown hair disheveled and her face pale with fear or determination. She carried herself with the straight-backed posture of someone educated in Boston's better schools, but her hands shook as she stepped into the circle of lamplight where Crowley could see her clearly. "Mr. Crowley," she said, her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. "I was hoping we might speak privately about some historical documents that were recently discovered in this building." "Were you indeed?" Crowley set his lamp on a wooden crate and studied Eleanor Hartwell with the calculating expression of a man who had spent decades evaluating the trustworthiness of sailors and merchants. "And what historical documents might those be, Miss Hartwell?" "My great-uncle's ship's log. Thomas Hartwell, first mate of the Isabella Marie." Martha pressed herself deeper into her hiding place, hardly daring to breathe. Great-uncle. Eleanor Hartwell was Thomas Hartwell's great-niece, which meant she had a family connection to the Isabella Marie that went far beyond academic research. She was here seeking answers about her own relatives, people who had vanished into the October storm of 1899 and never been seen again. "Ah yes, the famous ship's log." Crowley's tone carried bitter amusement. "The document that has brought so much unwanted attention to our quiet little town. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, what exactly did your great-uncle write in that log that has inspired the federal government to send inspectors to question our lighthouse keepers?" "He wrote that the Isabella Marie's crew saw signals from shore that night. Signals that appeared to be guiding them toward safe harbor, but actually led them into the rocks at Widow's Cove. And what conclusions have you drawn from that information?" Eleanor lifted her chin with a gesture that reminded Martha of her own moments of defiance against Ezra's rules. "I believe my great-uncle and the other survivors of the Isabella Marie reached shore alive. I believe they lived long enough to leave records of what happened to their ship. And I believe someone in this town knows what became of them after they reached land." Crowley was quiet for a long moment, studying Eleanor's face in the lamplight. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weariness that suggested he had been expecting this conversation for years. "Your great-uncle was indeed among the survivors who reached shore that night," he said slowly, "along with 6 other crew members, 4 passengers, and 2 children whose parents had died when the ship foundered. They were exhausted, injured, and desperate for help when they staggered up the beach at Widow's Cove." Martha felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Survivors. There had been survivors, just as Catherine Brewster suspected. People who had lived through the wreck of the Isabella Marie, who had reached safety, who should have been rescued and returned to their families. "What happened to them?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "They were helped." Crowley moved closer to Eleanor, and Martha could see the conflict in his weathered features. The struggle between a man who wanted to tell the truth and a man who understood the consequences of speaking dangerous words aloud. By people in this community who saw it as their Christian duty to aid shipwreck victims, regardless of the circumstances that had brought them to shore. But they never returned home. Their families never learned what had become of them. No. Crowley's voice dropped to a whisper. They did not return home. The basement fell silent, except for the sound of rain drumming against the windows and the distant creaking of timber as the old buildings settled around them. Martha could sense the weight of revelation hanging in the air between Crowley and Eleanor, the moment when carefully guarded secrets were about to be spoken aloud for the first time in 24 years. "Mr. Crowley," Eleanor said carefully, "I need to know what happened to my great-uncle Thomas. I need to know why he and the other survivors were never reported as rescued, why their families were allowed to mourn them as dead when they had actually reached safety. Crowley turned away from Eleanor and moved to one of the wooden crates stacked against the far wall. With practiced movements, he pried off the lid to reveal a collection of personal items: clothing, books, jewelry, small keepsakes that had clearly belonged to travelers rather than local residents. "These are effects that were recovered from the survivors," he said, lifting a leather-bound journal from the crate. "Your great-uncle's personal diary, along with items belonging to the others. They were kept here because—" He paused, seeming to choose his words with extreme care. "Because the survivors asked that they be preserved for their families, should those families ever come looking for the truth." Eleanor reached for the diary with trembling hands, but Crowley pulled it back before she could touch it. "Before you read what your great-uncle wrote," he said, "you need to understand the choice that was made that night. The survivors of the Isabella Marie reached shore, yes, but they brought with them information that would have destroyed lives, ruined careers, and torn this community apart if it had become public knowledge." "What information?" "The signals they saw from shore, the lights that guided them into the rocks, were not random or accidental." Crowley's face had gone ashen. They were being produced by people who had deliberately chosen to wreck the Isabella Marie. People who knew she was carrying a valuable cargo that could be salvaged and sold if the ship could be brought close enough to shore. The words hit Martha like physical blows. Deliberate wrecking. The Isabella Marie had not been lost to storm and accident, but to human greed and criminal conspiracy. The signals Thomas Hartwell had recorded in his ship's log were not maritime distress signals or lighthouse malfunctions, but the calculated actions of wreckers who had lured a merchant vessel to its destruction for the sake of plunder. "Who?" Eleanor's voice was raw with emotion. "Who were the wreckers?" "Prominent men in this community. Men with political connections and social standing, men whose disgrace would have brought down others along with them." Crowley set the diary back in the crate, with movements that suggested he was handling something precious and dangerous. "The survivors knew this, Miss Hartwell. They understood that if they returned to their families and told the truth about what had happened, they would be signing death warrants for themselves and possibly for their loved ones as well. So what did they choose? They chose to disappear, to take new names, to travel to places where they would not be recognized, to begin new lives far from the reach of the men who had destroyed the Isabella Marie." Crowley's voice carried infinite sadness. It was the only way they could survive with the knowledge they carried. Eleanor sank down onto a nearby crate, her face buried in her hands. "Thomas Hartwell lived. My great-uncle survived the wreck, and he lived, but he never came home. He never sent word to his family, never let us know he was safe. He wrote letters," Crowley said gently. "Letters to his sister, to his parents, to friends he had left behind. They are in that crate along with his diary, but he never sent them because he knew that any contact with his former life would put both him and his family in danger." Martha found herself thinking of her own unsent letters, the correspondence she had written to her sister in Portland, but never mailed because she could not bear to explain the isolation and restrictions of her life at Beacon Point. The parallel between her situation and that of the Isabella Marie survivors was too painful to contemplate. "Mr. Crowley," Eleanor said, raising her head from her hands, "the people responsible for wrecking the Isabella Marie, are they still alive? Are they still in positions where they could threaten anyone who spoke the truth about what happened?" Crowley's laugh was bitter and short. "Miss Hartwell, why do you think Inspector Thorne is currently at Beacon Point questioning the lighthouse keeper about records from 1899? Why do you think your research in this town has prompted visits from mayors and selectmen to librarians and archive keepers?" The implications crashed over Martha like a cold wave. The current investigation was not simply about historical curiosity or bureaucratic thoroughness. It was a desperate attempt to control information that could still destroy reputations and end careers 24 years after the Isabella Marie's destruction. The people responsible for the wreck were not only still alive, but still powerful enough to mobilize government resources to protect their secrets. "The wreckers," Eleanor whispered. "Some of them are still in positions of authority in this community. Some of them, yes. Others have sons or grandsons who have inherited both their wealth and their vulnerability to exposure." Crowley moved back toward the stairs, clearly eager to end this dangerous conversation. "Miss Hartwell, I have told you far more than is safe for either of us. If you are wise, you will take what I have shared and leave Millbrook immediately. Do not attempt to contact the authorities. Do not try to publish your great-uncle's story, and do not return to this town. But the truth, Miss Hartwell, is a luxury that some people cannot afford." Crowley picked up his lamp and started up the stairs. "Your great-uncle understood that 24 years ago. I pray that you are equally wise." His footsteps faded as he climbed to the main floor, leaving Eleanor alone in the basement with the crate of survivor's effects. Martha remained in her hiding place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid to acknowledge what she had just learned about the community where she had lived for 5 years. Eleanor stood slowly and moved to the crate, lifting out Thomas Hartwell's diary and several bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. In the dim light that filtered through the basement windows, Martha could see tears streaming down the younger woman's face as she held the last tangible connections to her great-uncle. "I know someone is there," Eleanor said quietly without looking up from the crate. "I heard you moving when Mr. Crowley was speaking. If you are another relative of the Isabella Marie survivors, if you have come here seeking the same answers I sought, then you should know that we are both in considerable danger now." Martha emerged slowly from her hiding place, her legs stiff from crouching in the narrow space between the crates. Eleanor looked up as she approached, and Martha was struck by the intelligence and determination in the younger woman's eyes, despite her obvious grief and fear. "I am Martha Whitmore," she said. "My husband is the current keeper of Beacon Point Light." Eleanor's eyes widened with understanding. "Then you are married to the man Inspector Thorne is investigating, the man they are trying to blame for irregularities in the lighthouse operation that night?" "Yes." Martha felt the full weight of their predicament settling on her shoulders. "My husband knows nothing about any of this. He has been an honest lighthouse keeper for 5 years, but if the government needs someone to blame for the Isabella Marie investigation, if they need to satisfy public curiosity while protecting the real criminals, they will sacrifice your husband to preserve their secrets," Eleanor finished. "Just as they forced my great-uncle to sacrifice his identity and his family connections to preserve his life." The two women looked at each other across the dusty basement, and Martha saw in Eleanor's face a reflection of her own desperate situation. They were both women whose lives had been shaped by the Isabella Marie disaster. Eleanor through the loss of family members she had never known were alive. Martha through the threat that hung over her husband's career and their future security. "Miss Hartwell," Martha said carefully, "what do you intend to do with the information Mr. Crowley has shared?" Eleanor clutched her great-uncle's diary against her chest. "I intended to expose the truth about the Isabella Marie, to clear the names of the crew members who were blamed for poor seamanship when they were actually the victims of deliberate wrecking. But now..." She looked around the basement with its collection of secrets and stolen lives. "Now I realize that pursuing the truth might destroy innocent people along with the guilty ones, including my husband." "Including your husband, yes." Eleanor met Martha's eyes with an expression of painful recognition. "Mrs. Whitmore, I believe we may be each other's only hope of finding a solution that serves justice without destroying the people we care about." As if summoned by her words, the sound of footsteps returned to the floor above. Multiple sets of footsteps this time, moving with the purposeful rhythm of men who had come to conduct serious business. Martha and Eleanor froze, listening to voices that carried clearly through the old building's thin walls. "The Hartwell woman was seen entering the building an hour ago," someone was saying. Crowley confirmed that she has been questioning him about the Isabella Marie survivors. "And the lighthouse keeper's wife!" This voice belonged to Mayor Aldrich, Martha realized with growing horror. Has she been making inquiries as well? According to Miss Brewster at the library, yes. Both women have been researching the same historical incident, and both represent potential threats to community stability. The footsteps moved toward the basement door, and Martha felt her world contracting to this single moment of crisis. Discovery would mean not only her own exposure as a trespasser, but also confirmation that she and Eleanor were working together to uncover secrets that powerful people had spent decades concealing. The consequences would extend far beyond embarrassment or legal charges. They would encompass the destruction of everything she and Ezra had built together at Beacon Point. Eleanor grabbed Martha's arm and pulled her toward a corner of the basement, where canvas tarps covered what appeared to be a pile of old fishing equipment. They crawled beneath the heavy fabric just as lamplight began to spill down the basement stairs, followed by the measured footsteps of men who had come to eliminate problems rather than solve them. The canvas tarp smelled of tar and old fish, and Martha had to press her face against the rough fabric to keep from coughing as dust motes swirled through the heavy air beneath their makeshift shelter. Eleanor's breathing beside her was quick and shallow, punctuated by the occasional catch that suggested she was fighting back tears or panic. Through gaps in the canvas, they could see yellow lamplight moving across the basement walls as the men above conducted their methodical search. "Check every crate." Mayor Aldrich's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Miss Hartwell has proven herself resourceful enough to gain access to restricted archives. We cannot assume she will be deterred by a simple locked door. What exactly are we looking for?" This voice belonged to someone Martha did not recognize. A younger man with the crisp diction of formal education and city living. "Evidence that our problem has grown beyond manageable proportions," Aldrich replied. "Documents that should not have been copied. Artifacts that should not have been examined. Correspondence that could connect the Hartwell woman's research to broader investigations." Martha felt Eleanor stiffen beside her at the mention of correspondence. Thomas Hartwell's unsent letters were still in the crate where Harbor Master Crowley had revealed them, along with the diary and other personal effects that could provide evidence of the Isabella Marie survivor's fate. If the men conducting this search discovered those items, they would have proof that Eleanor had learned far more than was safe for any of them. The sound of splintering wood filled the basement as someone pried open one of the storage crates. Papers rustled, and Martha heard the distinctive thud of books being dropped onto wooden surfaces. The men were not simply searching, they were destroying, eliminating records and artifacts that might pose future threats to their carefully maintained version of events. "Here," the younger man announced. "Personal effects from the Morrison estate, including what appears to be correspondence between the former lighthouse keeper and Coast Guard officials regarding the Isabella Marie incident." Martha's heart lurched. J. Morrison, the keeper who had been on duty at Beacon Point the night the Isabella Marie was wrecked. His estate had included documents that might shed light on what really happened that October evening, and now those documents were about to be destroyed by men who feared their contents. "Burn them," Aldrich ordered without hesitation. "All of it. We cannot risk having federal investigators discover materials that contradict the official account of the lighthouse operation that night." The smell of burning paper began to fill the basement, acrid and bitter in the confined space. Martha watched through the gap in the canvas as flames consumed documents that might have exonerated her husband and exposed the truth about the Isabella Marie disaster. Each page that turned to ash represented another avenue of investigation closed, another possibility for justice eliminated. "What about the Hartwell materials?" the younger man asked. The trunk from the Harbor Authority storage contained additional items that were never catalogued in the official salvage reports. Everything burns, Aldrich said firmly. We have indulged sentiment and historical preservation long enough. The federal investigation has reminded us that the past is never truly buried. It can always be excavated by people with sufficient motivation and resources. More wood splintered as they opened additional crates. Martha heard Eleanor's sharp intake of breath as her great-uncle's possessions were hauled into the light. The diary, the letters, the small personal items that represented the only tangible connections between Thomas Hartwell and the family he had been forced to abandon. Interesting, the younger man murmured. This diary contains detailed accounts of the wrecking operation. Names, dates, specific descriptions of the signals used to lure the Isabella Marie into the rocks, which is precisely why it must be destroyed, Aldrich replied, along with everything else that connects the incident to anyone currently living in this community. Martha felt Eleanor trembling beside her, and she reached out to grip the younger woman's hand in what she hoped was a gesture of comfort and solidarity. They were witnessing the final destruction of evidence that had taken Eleanor years to locate, the erasure of her great-uncle's story, and the stories of all the other Isabella Marie survivors who had been forced to disappear into new identities and new lives. The flames grew brighter, casting dancing shadows across the basement walls as decades of carefully preserved secrets were reduced to ash and smoke. Martha found herself thinking of her own letters to her sister, still hidden in her dresser drawer, still unsent, because the truth of her life was too dangerous to share. How many other people in Millbrook lived with similar secrets, similar fears, similar constraints on their ability to speak honestly about their experiences? "Mr. Mayor," a new voice called from the top of the basement stairs. "You need to come up here immediately. We have a situation." Aldrich's footsteps moved quickly toward the stairs, but the younger man remained behind to continue feeding documents to the flames. Martha could hear conversation from the main floor of the Harbor Authority building, urgent voices discussing something that had clearly disrupted their careful plans. "Inspector Thorne is requesting immediate access to the Harbor Authority archives," someone was saying. "He has federal authorization to examine all materials related to maritime incidents in this jurisdiction dating back to 1890. "That is impossible," Aldrich's voice carried barely controlled panic. "The archives are being reorganized." Many of the historical documents have been moved to secure storage pending proper cataloging. "He is not requesting access, Mr. Mayor. He is demanding it, and he has brought additional personnel from Boston to assist with the investigation." Martha felt a surge of hope mixed with terror. Inspector Thorne's investigation was expanding, which might mean salvation for Ezra if evidence could be found to expose the real circumstances of the Isabella Marie disaster. But it also meant that she and Eleanor were trapped in a basement where they had just witnessed the destruction of that very evidence, surrounded by men who would do anything to prevent their testimony from reaching federal investigators. The younger man's voice rose from near the makeshift fire. "Mr. Mayor, we have a problem down here as well. Some of these documents reference current residents of Millbrook, people whose fathers or grandfathers were involved in the original incident. If Inspector Thorne's investigation is as thorough as it appears to be, he will eventually identify the family connections and begin asking uncomfortable questions. Then we accelerate our timeline," Aldrich replied from the top of the stairs. "Finish destroying the archival materials, and make sure there is no physical evidence remaining that could connect the Isabella Marie investigation to anyone currently living." "What about the witnesses?" The Hartwell woman and the lighthouse keeper's wife have both been conducting research. They may have already learned enough to cause problems. The silence that followed stretched long enough for Martha to count her own heartbeats. When Aldrich finally spoke, his voice carried a coldness that made her blood freeze in her veins. "Problems require solutions," he said simply. "Make sure there are no witnesses to contradict the official account of the Isabella Marie incident. Make sure there are no researchers asking questions that cannot be safely answered. and make sure there are no documents remaining that could inspire future investigations. The implications of his words were unmistakable. Martha and Eleanor were not simply trespassers who had overheard dangerous information. They were witnesses whose continued existence threatened the safety of powerful people. The men in the basement were not simply destroying documents. They were eliminating evidence and preparing to eliminate the people who had seen that evidence. Eleanor's grip on Martha's hand tightened to the point of pain, and Martha could feel the younger woman's fear radiating through the canvas that concealed them. They were trapped in a basement with men who had just received orders to ensure their silence permanently, surrounded by burning documents that represented their only hope of proving the truth about the Isabella Marie disaster. The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs announced Aldrich's return, and Martha heard him moving purposefully among the storage crates as if he were searching for something specific. Metal scraped against wood, and she caught the distinctive click of a pistol being cocked and loaded. "Miss Hartwell," Aldrich called out in a conversational tone. "I know you are down here. Harbor Master Crowley saw you enter the building, and you have not left. I also suspect you are not alone. The lighthouse keeper's wife was seen in town today, and her interest in historical maritime incidents has been noted by several concerned citizens." Martha felt Eleanor's whole body go rigid beside her. Discovery was inevitable now. They could not remain hidden beneath the canvas indefinitely, and any attempt to escape would only confirm their presence and their guilt. "I am prepared to offer you both a choice," Aldrich continued, his voice echoing strangely in the smoke-filled basement. "You can emerge from wherever you are hiding and participate in a civilized discussion about the future of this community, or you can remain concealed until my associates find you, in which case your options will be considerably more limited." Martha closed her eyes and tried to think of Ezra, tried to imagine what he would do in a situation where all choices led to disaster. He would choose the option that offered the greatest chance of survival, she realized. Not for himself, but for her. He would sacrifice his own safety to protect hers, just as he had been trying to protect her with all his rules and restrictions and fears. But this time, her safety and his were inextricably linked. If she and Eleanor were silenced, if the evidence of the Isabella Marie conspiracy was destroyed completely, then Ezra would become the scapegoat for federal investigators who needed someone to blame for the irregularities in the lighthouse records. He would lose his position, his reputation, and possibly his freedom while the real criminals escaped justice once again. "Miss Hartwell," Aldrich called again. "Mrs. Whitmore, I am going to count to 10, and then my patience will be exhausted." Eleanor looked at Martha through the dim light beneath the canvas, and Martha saw in her eyes the same desperate calculation she was performing in her own mind. They could surrender and hope for mercy from men who had just ordered their elimination. They could remain hidden and hope the searchers would somehow overlook their hiding place. Or they could try to create a third option, a possibility that did not yet exist, but might be forged from courage and desperate necessity. 1, Aldrich began counting in his measured, authoritative voice. Martha made her choice. She gripped Eleanor's hand tightly and whispered the words that would either save them or doom them. "When I move, follow me toward the stairs. Do not stop, do not look back, and do not hesitate no matter what happens." 2. Eleanor nodded her understanding, her face pale but determined in the flickering light of the burning documents. 3. Martha gathered her strength and prepared to throw back the canvas tarp, to sprint across the basement toward the stairs, to gamble everything on the chance that surprise and desperation might overcome the advantages of preparation and firepower. 4. The sound of voices from the main floor grew louder, more urgent. Inspector Thorne's federal investigation was closing in on the Harbor Authority building, which meant their window of opportunity was shrinking by the minute. 5. Martha counted her own breaths and tried to remember the exact layout of the basement, the obstacles between their hiding place and the stairs, the distance they would have to cover before Aldrich and his associates could react. 6. Eleanor squeezed Martha's hand once, a gesture of solidarity and shared resolve that said more than words could have conveyed. 7. The smell of smoke was growing thicker, and Martha realized that the fire the men had started to destroy documents was beginning to spread to other materials in the basement. Soon the building itself might be in danger, which would bring fire brigades and additional witnesses that might complicate Aldrich's plans. 8. Martha took one final breath of the acrid air beneath the canvas tarp and prepared to stake everything on a desperate gamble for survival and justice. 9. She threw back the canvas and launched herself toward the basement stairs with Eleanor close behind her, running toward an uncertain future that might hold salvation or disaster, but would at least be faced with honesty and courage instead of hiding and fear. The basement erupted into chaos as Martha and Eleanor burst from their hiding place, their sudden movement overturning a burning crate that sent flaming papers cascading across the floor. Aldrich's startled curse mixed with the younger man's shout of alarm, but Martha had already reached the foot of the wooden stairs, her hand gripping the rail as she pulled herself upward with desperate strength. "Stop them!" Aldrich's voice cracked like a whip, followed immediately by the deafening report of his pistol firing into the basement's smoke-filled air. The bullet splintered the wooden stair rail inches from Martha's head, but she did not pause or look back. Behind her, Eleanor stumbled on the bottom step, then recovered and continued climbing as another shot rang out. The basement was filling with smoke now, and Martha could hear men coughing and cursing as they tried to navigate the burning debris that littered the floor. She reached the main floor of the Harbor Authority building and found herself face to face with Inspector Thorne, who stood in the doorway with 2 federal clerks flanking him like sentries. His weathered face registered shock at her sudden appearance, then grim understanding as Eleanor emerged from the basement behind her, with soot streaking her traveling dress and terror written across her features. "Mrs. Whitmore," Thorne said with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to reveal his thoughts before gathering all available information. "I was not aware you had business at the Harbor Authority today." "Inspector Thorne." Martha struggled to catch her breath, her chest burning from the smoke and exertion. "There are men in the basement burning documents related to the Isabella Marie investigation. They have been destroying evidence that would prove my husband's innocence and expose the real circumstances of the ship's loss." The sound of footsteps on the basement stairs announced the arrival of Mayor Aldrich, his face flushed with anger and his pistol still visible in his right hand. He paused when he saw Inspector Thorne, clearly calculating his options, as the federal investigation he had been trying to control suddenly confronted him in person. "Inspector," Aldrich said with forced calm, returning his weapon to its holster. "I was not expecting to see you here. I trust your investigation at Beacon Point is proceeding satisfactorily." Thorne's sharp eyes moved from Aldrich to Martha to Eleanor, taking in Eleanor's soot-stained dress and Martha's obvious distress. "I find myself curious about the nature of the emergency that required you to discharge a firearm in a public building, Mr. Mayor." "No emergency," Aldrich replied smoothly. "Merely a small fire in the basement storage area that we were attempting to contain. Miss Hartwell and Mrs. Whitmore were unfortunately trapped by the smoke when they came to examine historical materials for their research." Martha felt a surge of fury at Aldrich's casual lies, his attempt to transform their near murder into a simple accident. "That is not true," she said, her voice stronger now despite her racing heart. "Mayor Aldrich and his associates were systematically destroying documents related to the Isabella Marie disaster. They shot at us when we tried to escape from the basement where they had trapped us." Thorne's expression did not change, but Martha caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he was filing away every word for future reference. "Miss Hartwell," he said, addressing Eleanor directly, "I believe we have not been formally introduced, though your name has come to my attention in connection with recent inquiries about the Isabella Marie." Eleanor straightened her shoulders with visible effort, transforming herself from terrified fugitive back into the educated Boston woman who had traveled to Millbrook seeking answers about her family's history. "Inspector Thorne, I am Eleanor Hartwell, great-niece of Thomas Hartwell, first mate of the Isabella Marie. I have been researching the circumstances of the ship's loss and the fate of the crew members who survived the initial wreck. Survived? Thorne's voice sharpened with professional interest. The official reports indicate that all hands were lost when the Isabella Marie foundered. The official reports are incomplete, Eleanor replied, glancing nervously at Aldrich, who stood like a coiled snake ready to strike. My great-uncle's ship's log, which was recently discovered in this building, indicates that several crew members and passengers reached shore alive. Additional evidence suggests that these survivors were forced to disappear rather than return to their families because they possessed knowledge that certain people in this community wished to keep hidden. The younger man who had been helping to burn documents appeared at the top of the basement stairs, his face blackened with soot and his clothes reeking of smoke. He took in the scene in the main office with obvious alarm, clearly recognizing that their careful plans had collapsed into uncontrolled chaos. "The fire is spreading," he reported to Aldrich in a low voice. "We need to evacuate the building before the structure is compromised." Thorne stepped forward with the authority of federal law behind him. "No one leaves this building until I have examined whatever remains of the documents that were being burned in the basement. Mr. Mayor, you will provide me with a complete accounting of what materials were stored in the Harbor Authority archives and why those materials were being destroyed during an active federal investigation." Aldrich's mask of civic respectability finally slipped, revealing the cornered desperation beneath. "Inspector, I think you misunderstand the situation. The Harbor Authority building is municipal property, and the disposal of outdated records falls under local administrative authority. Your investigation pertains specifically to lighthouse operations, not to broader municipal functions. My investigation pertains to any evidence relevant to the loss of the Isabella Marie," Thorne replied, with steel in his voice. "Including evidence of criminal conspiracy to wreck merchant vessels, evidence of the suppression of survivor testimony, and evidence of the ongoing obstruction of federal investigations." Martha felt her world shift as Thorne's words confirmed what she had barely dared to hope: that the federal investigation was far more comprehensive than anyone in Millbrook had realized, that Inspector Thorne had come to their town with knowledge and suspicions that went well beyond simple lighthouse record-keeping irregularities. "Inspector," she said, stepping closer to him despite Aldrich's murderous glare. "Before the documents were burned, I witnessed Harbor Master Crowley reveal the existence of personal effects belonging to Isabella Marie survivors, including a diary written by Thomas Hartwell that contained detailed accounts of the wrecking operation. The diary named specific individuals who were responsible for producing the false signals that lured the ship into the rocks." Aldrich's hand moved toward his holster, but Thorne's sharp command stopped him before he could draw the weapon. "Mr. Mayor, you will keep your hands where I can see them. Gentlemen," he addressed his federal clerks, "please secure Mr." Aldrich and his associate pending further investigation. The younger man bolted for the building's rear exit, but one of Thorne's clerks was faster, tackling him before he could reach the door. Martha watched with grim satisfaction as federal authority finally asserted itself over the local conspiracy that had controlled Millbrook for 24 years. But her relief was short-lived. The smell of smoke was growing stronger, and she could hear the ominous crackling of flames from the basement as the fire spread beyond the documents to the building's structural timbers. If the Harbor Authority building burned completely, any remaining evidence of the Isabella Marie conspiracy would be lost forever. "Inspector," Eleanor said urgently, "there may still be salvageable documents in the basement storage area. If we could organize a bucket brigade from the wharf, we might be able to save some of the materials before the fire destroys everything." Thorne nodded grimly. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you guide my clerks to the specific location where these documents were stored?" Martha hesitated, remembering the smoke-filled chaos of the basement and the very real danger of structural collapse. But she also remembered Ezra, alone at Beacon Point with his fears about losing their position, unaware that the federal investigation might finally expose the truth that would exonerate him completely. "Yes," she said firmly. But Inspector, there is something else you need to know about the lighthouse operation that night. My husband is innocent of any wrongdoing, but there may be evidence in his current records that will help prove what really happened in 1899. What kind of evidence? Martha thought of the sounds that had been haunting her dreams, the voices she heard in the storm winds that wrapped around Beacon Point on rough nights. The lighthouse logbooks from the past 5 years contain observations about unusual acoustic phenomena during storms, sounds that seem to carry across the water from the direction of Widow's Cove, sounds that might be... She paused, knowing how her next words would sound to rational men who dealt in facts and documentation rather than intuition and possibility. What kind of sounds, Mrs. Whitmore? Voices, she said simply. Human voices calling for help, singing, sometimes weeping. They are most audible during storms that produce wind patterns similar to those recorded on October 15th, 1899. Eleanor's face went pale with understanding. The survivors who were forced to disappear, if some of them died at Widow's Cove before they could escape, if their bodies were never properly buried. You are suggesting that the lighthouse has been receiving supernatural communications from deceased Isabella Marie passengers, Thorne said, with the careful tone of a man who was trying not to dismiss possibilities that might be relevant to his investigation. Martha shook her head. I am suggesting that the acoustic properties of the coastline around Widow's Cove might be preserving and transmitting sounds from that night in, ways that we do not fully understand, sounds that could provide additional testimony about what the survivors experienced before they died or disappeared. The building shuddered around them as the fire reached load-bearing timbers in the basement, and Martha realized that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Whatever evidence remained in the Harbor Authority archives would be lost within minutes unless they acted immediately. Inspector, she said, making a decision that would have horrified Ezra if he had been present to witness it. If you want to hear those voices for yourself, if you want testimony from the Isabella Marie survivors that no amount of document burning can destroy, then you need to come with me to Beacon Point tonight. The storm that is building off the coast will produce the same wind patterns that occurred 24 years ago, and if my theory is correct, you will hear exactly what happened at Widow's Cove that October night. Thorne studied her face with the intensity of a man who had built his career on the ability to distinguish truth from deception. Mrs. Whitmore, are you asking me to base a federal investigation on supernatural phenomena? I am asking you to listen, Martha replied. To come to Beacon Point tonight with open ears and an open mind, and to hear testimony from witnesses who have been trying to tell their story for 24 years, but have never found anyone willing to believe them. The building groaned ominously around them as the fire consumed more of its structural supports, but Martha stood her ground, waiting for Inspector Thorne's decision. Outside, she could hear the voices of townspeople gathering to fight the blaze, unaware that the real battle was being fought in the smoke-filled office where federal authority finally confronted the conspiracy that had shaped their community's history. Eleanor moved to stand beside Martha, presenting a united front of women who had risked everything to uncover the truth about the Isabella Marie disaster. Inspector, she said quietly, my great-uncle and the other survivors deserve to have their story heard. If there is any chance, however small, that their voices can still reach us across the years, then we owe it to them to listen. Thorne looked from Martha to Eleanor, to the flames that were beginning to lick at the basement stairs, calculating risks and possibilities with the methodical precision that had made him effective in his federal position. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a man who was gambling his career on the judgment of 2 women who claimed to hear voices from the past. Very well, he said. Tonight, when the storm reaches its full intensity, I will accompany you to Beacon Point. We will listen for whatever testimony the wind might carry from Widow's Cove, and we will determine once and for all what really happened to the Isabella Marie and her passengers on that October night, 24 years ago. The storm struck Beacon Point at sunset, bringing with it the same savage wind patterns that had torn through the region on October 15th, 1899. Martha stood in the lighthouse gallery beside Inspector Thorne and Eleanor Hartwell, watching the sea transform from gray swells to towering black walls of water that crashed against the granite foundation with enough force to shake the entire structure. The beacon swept its 4-second rhythm across the chaos below, but tonight its light seemed insignificant against the fury of nature unleashed. Ezra had not spoken to her since Inspector Thorne's arrival with his federal clerks and his uncompromising demands for a complete review of lighthouse operations. Her husband moved through his duties with the mechanical precision of a man whose world had contracted to the simple requirements of maintaining the light. Oil levels checked, lens cleaned, clockwork mechanism wound with mathematical regularity. He asked no questions about her absence that afternoon, made no comments about the soot stains on her dress or the federal officials who had commandeered their kitchen table as a temporary headquarters. But Martha could see the fear in his eyes, the terrible understanding that forces beyond his control were converging on Beacon Point with the same inexorable power as the storm that hammered the coast. 24 years of careful silence were ending tonight, and whatever emerged from the wreckage would determine not only the truth about the Isabella Marie, but also the future of everyone whose lives had been shaped by that October night. The wind direction is shifting to match the patterns recorded in 1899, Thorne observed, consulting a leather-bound notebook where he had been comparing historical weather data with current conditions. If your theory about acoustic transmission has any merit, Mrs. Whitmore, we should begin to detect unusual phenomena within the next hour. Eleanor pressed her face against the gallery's salt-stained windows, staring south toward the dark outline of Widow's Cove. "I can see lights down there," she said quietly. "Small fires, like signal lanterns." Martha followed Eleanor's gaze and felt her heart constrict with recognition. The lights that flickered among the rocks of Widow's Cove were indeed identical to those described in Thomas Hartwell's ship's log, deliberate signals designed to guide vessels toward destruction rather than safety. But these lights belonged to the present rather than the past, evidence that the conspiracy which had destroyed the Isabella Marie was still active after 24 years. "Inspector," Martha said urgently, "those are the same false signals that lured the Isabella Marie into the rocks. Someone is repeating the wrecking operation tonight." Thorne raised a telescope to his eye and studied the distant lights with professional concentration. "There appears to be a vessel approaching from the northeast," he reported grimly. "A coastal freighter, probably seeking shelter from the storm." The implications crashed over Martha like the waves that pounded the lighthouse foundation. The Isabella Marie conspiracy had not ended with the destruction of documents in the Harbor Authority basement. It had merely been interrupted. Tonight, with federal investigators occupied at Beacon Point and local authorities presumably neutralized by arrests, the wreckers were attempting to claim another victim. "We have to warn them," Eleanor said desperately. "The ship's captain has no way of knowing that those signals are false." Martha looked at the lighthouse beacon sweeping its regular pattern across the storm-tossed sea, then at Ezra, who stood at the lamp controls with his weathered hands steady despite the crisis that surrounded him. For 5 years, he had maintained Beacon Point light according to regulations and tradition, never deviating from established procedures, never taking risks that might jeopardize their position or their safety. But tonight, following regulations would mean allowing innocent sailors to die in the same trap that had claimed the Isabella Marie. Tonight, her husband would have to choose between his duty to lighthouse protocol and his duty to human life. "Ezra," she said, moving to his side at the lamp controls. "There is a ship out there being led to destruction by the same false signals that destroyed the Isabella Marie. We can save them, but only if we change the beacon pattern to warn them away from Widow's Cove." His gray eyes met hers with an expression she had never seen before. Not fear, or anger, or the careful neutrality he used when dealing with authority figures, but something deeper and more complex. Understanding, perhaps, that their moment of choice had finally arrived. That all his years of protection and restriction had led to this single decision that would define the rest of their lives. Changing the beacon pattern without authorization would be a violation of lighthouse regulations, he said carefully. It could cost us our position here, and not changing it will cost those sailors their lives, Martha replied. Just as it cost the Isabella Marie passengers their lives. 24 years ago, Thorne lowered his telescope and turned from the window with the grim determination of a man who had finally assembled all the pieces of a complex puzzle. Mr. Whitmore, as a federal inspector conducting an investigation into lighthouse operations, I am hereby authorizing you to modify the beacon pattern as necessary to prevent the loss of human life. Any consequences resulting from this action will be my responsibility rather than yours. Ezra's hands moved to the lamp controls with the same steady precision he brought to all his duties, but Martha could see the tremor in his fingers as he prepared to violate 23 years of rigid adherence to established procedures. The beacon's rhythm changed from 4 seconds of light, followed by 6 seconds of darkness, to a rapid pattern of short flashes, the international distress signal that would warn the approaching freighter of immediate danger. The effect was almost instantaneous. Through the telescope, they could see the distant vessel's navigation lights alter course, turning away from the false signals at Widow's Cove toward the safer waters beyond the reach of the wrecking operation. The conspiracy that had claimed the Isabella Marie would not claim another victim tonight. But as Martha watched the freighter escape the trap that had been set for it, she began to hear something else rising above the wind and waves. Voices carried on the storm-lashed air, human voices that seemed to emerge from the direction of Widow's Cove itself. "Do you hear that?" Eleanor whispered, gripping Martha's arm with sudden intensity. The voices grew stronger as the storm reached its peak intensity. No longer fragments of sound that might be dismissed as imagination, but clear human speech carried across the water by acoustic phenomena that none of them fully understood. Martha could distinguish individual words now, fragments of conversation that seemed to echo across 24 years of enforced silence. "The signals are false," a man's voice called across the howling wind. "They are leading us into the rocks deliberately." "Thomas?" Eleanor's voice broke as she recognized something in the speaker's tone. "Thomas, is that you?" A woman's voice joined the first, weeping or singing, or perhaps both. "My children are gone. The water took them when the ship broke apart. Why did no one come to help us?" More voices rose from the storm, overlapping and interweaving, until Martha could hear what sounded like dozens of people speaking at once. Crew members of the Isabella Marie calling out their final testimony, passengers describing their last moments aboard the doomed vessel, survivors recounting what they had witnessed on the beach at Widow's Cove before they died or disappeared. "We reached shore alive," Thomas Hartwell's voice carried clearly across the water. 13 of us survived the wreck and made it to land. But the men who had wrecked our ship were waiting for us on the beach. Inspector Thorne was writing frantically in his notebook, recording every word that emerged from the supernatural testimony. "What men?" he called out into the storm. "Who was responsible for producing the false signals?" "Harbor Master Crowley's father," the voice replied. "Mayor Aldrich's uncle. 3 of the town selectmen and 2 members of the Merchants' Council. They had been wrecking ships along this coast for years, stealing cargo and eliminating witnesses." Eleanor was weeping openly now, tears streaming down her face as she listened to her great-uncle's voice describe the final hours of the Isabella Marie survivors. "What happened to you, Thomas? What happened to the people who reached shore?" "Some of us escaped into the forest." Thomas Hartwell's voice carried infinite sadness across the decades. "We were given new names, new identities, told to disappear forever if we wanted to live. But others." His voice faded momentarily then returned with terrible clarity. Others were murdered on the beach to ensure their silence. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves among the rocks of Widow's Cove. The lighthouse gallery fell silent, except for the sound of wind and waves, and Inspector Thorne's pen scratching across paper as he documented testimony from witnesses who had been dead for 24 years. Martha felt Ezra's hand find hers in the darkness, his calloused fingers intertwining with her own as they listened to the voices of people whose stories had shaped their lives without their knowledge. "The lighthouse keeper that night," another voice called from the storm. An older woman, perhaps one of the Isabella Marie passengers. Samuel Morrison. He saw what was happening from the lighthouse gallery, but he was threatened into silence. They told him his family would die if he reported what he had witnessed. Martha felt the final pieces of the puzzle falling into place. Samuel Morrison, the previous keeper of Beacon Point Light, had not simply failed to assist the Isabella Marie. He had been forced to remain silent about the wrecking operation he had observed from the lighthouse gallery. His careful logbook entries, his precise adherence to official procedures, his refusal to record any irregularities from that October night, all of it had been the result of threats against his family, rather than professional incompetence. "Inspector," she said quietly, "Samuel Morrison was not complicit in the wrecking operation. He was another victim of the conspiracy, forced to hide the truth to protect his loved ones." Thorne nodded grimly, still writing as the voices from Widow's Cove continued their supernatural testimony. The storm was beginning to diminish now, the wind patterns shifting away from the precise configurations that had allowed the voices to reach them across water and time. Soon the acoustic phenomena would fade, and the Isabella Marie survivors would return to their long silence. But their testimony had been recorded. Their story had finally been told to someone with the authority and resources to seek justice for the crimes committed 24 years ago, and the cover-up that had continued ever since. "Thank you," Eleanor called out across the water, as the voices grew fainter. "Thank you for telling us what really happened. Your story will not be forgotten again." Thomas Hartwell's voice came one final time, barely audible above the diminishing wind. "Tell our families we reached shore. Tell them we tried to come home. As dawn broke over Beacon Point, Martha stood in the kitchen where Inspector Thorne was organizing his notes and preparing his final report on the Isabella Marie investigation. The federal clerks had departed at first light to begin the process of exhuming unmarked graves at Widow's Cove, and Ezra was in the lighthouse lamp room conducting his morning maintenance routine with the same careful attention to detail he had brought to his duties for 5 years. But everything had changed in the hours since the storm had passed. The conspiracy that had controlled Millbrook for 24 years was finished, destroyed by testimony from witnesses who had refused to remain silent despite death itself. Mayor Aldrich and his associates would face federal charges for conspiracy, murder, and obstruction of justice. The families of Isabella Marie passengers would finally learn the truth about their loved one's fate. And Martha and Ezra would remain at Beacon Point, their position secure, their future no longer threatened by secrets they had never been allowed to know. "Mrs. Whitmore," Inspector Thorne said as he prepared to depart, "I want you to know that your courage in pursuing this investigation has prevented not only tonight's potential tragedy, but countless future crimes. The wrecking operation you exposed has been responsible for at least 6 ship losses over the past 25 years. Martha nodded, thinking of all the voices that had been silenced, all the families that had mourned loved ones without ever learning the truth about their deaths. The Isabella Marie survivors had finally found justice, but their victory had come at a terrible cost in time and suffering. Eleanor appeared in the kitchen doorway with her travel bag in hand, ready to return to Boston with copies of her great-uncle's testimony and documentation that would allow her to contact other survivor families who had spent decades wondering about their missing relatives. "Martha," she said quietly, "I cannot adequately thank you for what you have done. Without your willingness to risk everything for the truth, Thomas and the others would have remained voiceless forever." The two women embraced, with the understanding that their shared ordeal had created a bond that would endure regardless of the distance that would separate them. They had faced down powerful men who had controlled their community through fear and violence, and they had emerged victorious through courage and determination rather than superior resources or political connections. As Inspector Thorne's government carriage disappeared down the winding road toward Millbrook, Martha climbed the spiral stairs to the lighthouse gallery, where Ezra was adjusting the beacon mechanism for the coming night. The sea stretched endlessly before them, blue-green and peaceful in the afternoon sunlight, showing no trace of the supernatural drama that had unfolded during the storm. "Martha," Ezra said, without turning from his work, "I owe you an apology for the rules I imposed during our years here. I thought I was protecting you from dangers I could not name or explain. I did not realize I was also protecting you from the truth that might have set us both free years ago." She moved to stand beside him at the gallery railing, looking out over the water toward Widow's Cove, where federal investigators were beginning their careful excavation of graves that had been hidden for 24 years. The lighthouse beacon would continue its faithful rhythm tonight and every night thereafter. But now, it would shine on waters where justice had finally been served and voices long silenced had been heard. "The rules were necessary," Martha said gently. "Without them, we might not have survived long enough to learn the truth. But now that we know what really happened here, now that the conspiracy is finished, perhaps we can begin to live without fear." Ezra's weathered hand found hers on the iron railing, and together they watched the sun set over waters that would never again conceal the secrets of the Isabella Marie. The voices that had called across 24 years of silence had finally found peace, and the lighthouse that had witnessed their tragedy would stand as a beacon of truth for all the ships that would pass safely through these waters in the years to come. In the distance, barely visible against the darkening horizon, Martha thought she could see lights moving along the coast near Widow's Cove, not the false signals of wreckers this time, but the lanterns of investigators working to give proper burial to people who had died far from home and family. The Isabella Marie survivors would finally rest in marked graves, their names recorded in official documents, their stories preserved for future generations who would learn that truth, however long delayed, was stronger than any conspiracy designed to suppress it. The lighthouse beam began its nightly sweep across the peaceful sea. 4 seconds of brilliance followed by 6 seconds of darkness, guiding mariners safely past the rocks, where so many had perished, and toward harbors where they would find genuine welcome rather than calculated destruction. And in the keeper's cottage below, Martha and Ezra began their new life together. A life free from the secrets and fears that had shaped their marriage. A life illuminated by truth as steady and reliable as the beacon that crowned their isolated home on the edge of the endless Atlantic.